Hello everybody, my name's Yuno, and welcome back. Today, don't mind my voice, I'm a little congested, weather's getting colder, and I thought it'd be a perfect time for, another story type video, like the r/short scary stories video. I wanted to do something similar, so I decided today, it's time to venture out forth to r/NoSleep. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Every evening, at precisely 10 p.m., the man appeared in the window across from mine. I first noticed him on a foggy October night. I was pacing around my tiny apartment trying to work out a problem for a client, when my gaze wandered to the old building across the street. Through the dim haze, I could just make out a figure, barely visible, framed in the dusty glass of an upstairs window. At first, I thought nothing of it. He was probably just a neighbor, taking a quick look outside. But the next night at exactly 10 p.m., there he was again, staying in that same spot, staring into the street. Something about the way he stood made my skin crawl. His face was barely visible, shrouded in shadow, but I could make out the pale outline of his eyes. He was watching me. I closed the blinds that night, uneasy, but every evening after that, no matter how hard I tried to ignore him, I felt his presence. Curiosity, or perhaps a growing sense of dread, got the better of me. Each night I would watch the clock, my heart pounding, until the hour struck 10, and there he would be. Days turned into weeks, and the man never missed a night, always standing in the same spot, in the same eerie, unbroken silence. He never waved, never moved, just watched, as though waiting for something. One night, I decided to wave to him. I wanted to see if he'd respond. As soon as the clock hit 10, I pulled back the blinds and raised my hand, hesitantly, toward the window. His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, I thought he was going to lift his own hand. Instead, his lips curled into a small, unsettling smile, revealing darkened, uneven teeth. My skin prickled. I quickly closed the blinds, trying to shake off the creeping chill that had settled over me. That was the first night I heard him. I had just started drifting off to sleep when a faint tapping echoed through my apartment. My eyes snapped open, heart hammering. The tapping was steady, deliberate, like someone lightly rapping their knuckles against glass. I lay frozen, listening, trying to place the sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from my window. Slowly, dreading what I might see, I turned toward it, through the thin fabric of my blinds. I could make out a shadowy outline, standing on the fire escape outside my apartment, a face pressed close to the glass, a wide, toothy smile, just barely visible enough through the slats. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, but I was paralyzed. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it was just my imagination, that the man in the window was only a trick of the light, a shadow cast by passing cars. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Somehow, I managed to bolt upright, grabbing my phone and dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The dispatcher answered, her voice a steady anchor in the dark. I whispered, terrified he might hear me, that there was someone on my fire escape. Within minutes, I heard the wail of sirens. I didn't dare open my eyes until I felt the reassuring presence of the police officers. They searched the fire escape, the alley, the entire building, but found nothing. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing to indicate anyone had been there at all. The officer suggested it was just a nightmare, a figment of my imagination, but I knew what I'd seen. I could still feel the weight of his gaze, the pressure of his face pressed against my window. That night, I barely slept, the man's smile haunting my every thought. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was over, that he wouldn't return, But as the clock struck 10, I found myself unable to resist looking out the window. He was there, staring back at me from across the street. This time, though, he looked different. His face was somehow clearer, his features sharper, more defined. His eyes were glassy and dull, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. And there was something else. He was holding up a piece of paper against the glass. It was a small yellowed scrap, crinkled around the edges. I squinted, trying to read the faint, scrawled words. "I'm watching." I stumbled back, heart racing. But when I looked again, the note was gone. The man was gone. The window across the street was empty, as though he had never been there at all. For days I waited, dreading the hour of 10 o'clock. The silence gnawed at me, filling my mind with dread. But after a week, when he didn't reappear, I began to hope that maybe it was over. One night, weeks later, I was drifting off to sleep when a loud knock jolted me awake. I froze, straining my ears, praying I'd imagined it. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was coming from my front door. My heart raced as I forced myself to get up. Creeping slowly toward the door, as I got closer, I could hear something. A faint, rasping whisper, barely audible through the thick wood. "Let me in." The whisper was dry, hollow, like dead leaves scraping against pavement. I backed away, shaking. I turned on every light in my apartment, trying to drown out the darkness, the growing terror that filled me. The knocking continued, steady, rhythmic, unyielding. "Let me in." Desperate, I dialed the police again, but by the time they arrived, the knocking had stopped. The officers looked at me with pity, clearly doubting my story. They left soon after, telling me to call if I had any more trouble. For hours, I sat in silence, barely breathing, waiting for the knocking to start again. But it didn't. I never heard it again. A few days later, I noticed the building across the street was empty. No lights, no movement. It was as though the place had been abandoned. Curious, and maybe a little desperate for closure, I went over to ask around, hoping to learn something about the man in the window. The landlord, an elderly woman, looked at me with wide eyes when I mentioned him. "No one's lived there for months," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The last tenant, well, he disappeared. The police never found him. The only thing they found in the apartment was a note left on his window. It said, 'I'm watching.'" Her words chilled me to the core. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something. I could still feel his eyes on me, watching from somewhere unseen, waiting for the moment I'd let him in. It all happened while I was on my way to visit my parents for some time away from the big city. My parents were always country folk who had always loved to be out in the middle of the wilderness. As I was driving through the highway, it started to rain a little. Nothing I didn't really worry about. Tank was still full of gas, my music was on, it could have been much worse. But I was wrong, me and my big mouth, right? My car ended up making noises that didn't sound normal. As in, it didn't sound like a car should be making those noises, and I was wondering if it was working properly. I wasn't an expert on cars, but something told me to pull over. I ended up kicking my car in frustration as I exhausted pretty much all of my options on trying to get it moving again. I ended up realizing that I had to start walking, maybe find someone who could help me with this. I couldn't call my parents because my cell phone had no service. I was in the middle of nowhere. I had to hurry and maybe find some place I could spend the night. Maybe when the rain cleared up, I could sort out this car problem in the morning. After what seemed like hours of walking, I saw it. The hotel sat on a lonely stretch of highway, a flickering neon sign casting a sickly glow on the empty parking lot. At this point, I was desperate. My car had broken down miles from the nearest town, and the rain had turned into a downpour that had me soaked to the bone. Through the sheets of rain, the hotel loomed like a dark bruise on the side of the road, and I had no choice but to seek refuge. They always say hindsight is 20/20, but desperate people do desperate things. Inside, the place was even worse. The lobby was dim, smelling of mildew, and something faintly metallic. The old woman at the front desk handed me a key with a smile that never reached her eyes, murmuring, "Room 13, the only one we have tonight." "Thanks, it'll do." Room 13. The number stuck to my mind. It felt unsettling, but I was exhausted and cold. I had no time to be picky or nervous. I just wanted to sleep. The room itself was no better than the lobby. Bare bulbs hung from the ceiling and the wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing dark stains underneath. But it was a bed, and at that point, I would have slept anywhere. I tossed most of my wet clothes onto the floor, climbed under the covers, and closed my eyes, trying not to think about the faint, sour smell wafting up from the mattress. I hadn't been asleep long when the scratching started. At first, it was faint. I thought it might have been the wind rattling against the old windows, or maybe an animal crawling around in the walls. I rolled over, pulling the pillow over my head, but the scratching grew louder. It was coming from under the bed. That's when I started to get a bit creeped out. The sound was too deliberate, too precise to be an animal. I told myself not to look, to stay in bed and ignore it. But as soon as I thought that, the scratching stopped. A few seconds later, the bed shifted. I was shaking slightly from the sudden movement. It wasn't much, just a faint movement, like something or someone was pushing up from underneath. I felt my stomach tighten as I lay completely still, hoping that whatever was down there didn't know I was awake. But then, just as I began to relax, I heard a whisper. "Come closer." I squeezed my eyes shut, barely able to breathe. The whisper came again, rasping and dry like paper tearing in two. "Come closer. I need to tell you something." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It felt like ice was filling my veins, freezing me in place. Then came a long drawn-out sigh from beneath the bed, followed by a low, mocking laugh. "Fine, I'll come closer." The bed lurched, slamming hard enough to lift me up, and that was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I leapt out, scrambling toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. My hands were shaking too hard to turn the lock. I fumbled, feeling the growing pressure behind me, like someone standing close enough to touch. But before I could turn around, I heard the voice again, louder this time, whispering right next to my ear. "I just wanted you to know, it's not your bed you're sleeping in." My breath caught, my heart hammering as I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. I fell against the bed, half expecting to feel something clawing at me from underneath. But there was nothing there, just silence and the dead, stale air of the room. In a panic, I ripped open the closet door, desperate for a place to hide. My mind raced. I had no phone, no working phone, no way to call for help, and the rain still hammered down outside, isolating me further. I crouched in the closet, heart pounding, trying to calm my breathing. But then I noticed a smell, a thick, cloying odor. It was metallic and wet, stronger now that I was in the closet. My stomach twisted as I looked down. There, on the floor, was a dark, sticky stain. It pooled beneath a pair of feet, their skin pale and mottled, visible under a tattered dress that hung from the figure like dead leaves. It was a woman, her face twisted in a silent scream, her arms contorted at unnatural angles. She stared straight ahead, her glassy eyes unseeing, or at least that's what I thought. As I watched, her eyes flicked to mine, the corners of her mouth stretching into a grin, and she whispered, "He doesn't like it when you hide." I stumbled backward out of the closet, my whole body screaming to run, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. She was still smiling, that awful, silent grin that seemed like it was stretching wider. Her lifeless eyes locked onto mine. My heart pounded as I backed away, feeling my way toward the door. But when my hand reached the knob, I found it was ice cold. So cold it burned. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, as if something was pressing down from every direction. I forced myself to look away from her, to try to lock again, but my fingers were stiff and clumsy from the cold. I twisted and pulled, but the lock wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I yanked. I was trapped. I was beyond terrified. A shuffling sound echoed from the closet. I didn't want to turn around, but some part of me had to. Against every ounce of common sense, I glanced over my shoulder. The woman in the closet was moving. She was crawling toward me, inch by inch, her twisted arms scraping against the floor, her eyes wide and empty. As she dragged herself forward, her broken fingers left dark streaks in her wake, a trail of blood or something darker. "I tried to leave too," she hissed, her voice raw and brittle, as if it hadn't been used in years. "He doesn't let you go. He keeps you here." I backed into the corner near the door, feeling the wall cold and rough against my spine. My throat felt tight, my whole body locked in place as I watched her draw closer. Her eyes, hollow and sunken, had bored into me, full of something I couldn't understand. Rage? Desperation? Maybe even hunger. Then, just inches from my feet, she stopped. Her head jerked upward, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine as her gaze shifted. Not at me, but at something behind me. "He's here," she whispered, a shiver in her voice. "He's always watching." I wanted to scream, to get out of this nightmare, but a noise stopped me, a soft creak, like the slow groan of a door opening. I forced myself to turn, and there, in the shadowed corner of the room, I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs too long and bent in the wrong places. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It was draped in tattered black cloth, which clung to its form like a shroud. Its face, it had no face, just a smooth, pale surface, featureless, but somehow filled with malice. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, a cold, hollow presence that sucked the air from the room. But then, slowly, it raised one hand, pointing a single, bony finger directly at me. "He's chosen you," the woman rasped, her eyes wide with fear. She was backing away now, retreating into the darkness of the closet. "He always chooses someone, and once he chooses, he never lets go." "No!" I whispered, the word barely audible. "No! Stay away from me! No!" But the figure took a step forward, the room growing colder with each movement. The walls seeming to close in. I could feel it pulling at me, dragging me toward it, like an invisible hand clutching at my chest. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees, staring up at that faceless horror as it loomed over me. Then I saw what looked like its mouth open. It didn't just open, it tore it open as if it were ripping open its very flesh. It was open in a silent scream. Then, in a voice that sounded like nails scraping over glass, it spoke. "Stay," it said, the word echoing, filling the room. "Stay forever." My body went rigid, every nerve screaming to run. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped under that thing's gaze, or whatever it was that served as its gaze. The shadows around me darkened, and I felt a weight pressing down on my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. I tried to scream, to call for help, but no one came out. The room spun, darkness creeping in at the edges of my vision, and just before I blacked out, I heard one last whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. "Room 13 always needs a guest." When I woke up, everything was quiet. I was lying in the middle of the floor, the stale smell of the room thick in my nose. My head ached, and every inch of my body felt like it had been crushed under a rock for a brief moment. I thought maybe I dreamed it all, that it had been some kind of feverish nightmare. But then I looked around and the room was empty. No twisted woman, no faceless figure, but the odor was wide open and outside. I could see the early light of dawn peeking through the old hotel windows. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled to my feet, every instinct screaming to get out. My clothes were still damp. My car was still broken down. But I didn't care. I sprinted out of the room, down the narrow hallway, through the lobby, and into the rain-soaked parking lot. As I stumbled toward the road, I glanced back. The hotel loomed behind me, dark and silent, its sign flickering in the dawnlight. But there, in the doorway, I saw a figure standing, watching me. It was the old woman from the front desk. She raised a hand, giving me a slow, sad wave, and in that moment, I saw her face clearly for the first time. She looked like the woman from the closet, older perhaps, but unmistakably the same. Her eyes were hollow, empty, as if there was nothing behind them. She had that same smile that just seemed just as hollow. And as I turned away, a chill ran down my spine, because I swear I heard her whisper, drifting through the cold morning air. "We'll be ready for you, whenever you decide to come back." I didn't look back. I broke into a full sprint. I kept running. I didn't stop until I was well down the highway, legs shaking, lungs burning. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the empty road. My mind was a blur, replaying every horrific detail, every sound, every face. Finally, a car pulled over. A beat-up pickup with a grizzled old driver who took one look at my drenched clothes and haunted expression, and without a word, opened the passenger door. "Trouble?" he asked as I climbed in, trying to catch my breath. "Yeah," I managed, voice hoarse. "Broke down. Stayed at some motel." I realized I didn't even know its name. He didn't say anything for a minute, eyes on the road. Then he asked, almost too casually, "That wouldn't have been the old Harway Motel, would it? Little ways back, place with the busted up neon sign." I felt a shiver roll over me and nodded. How did he know? He sucked in his breath. "Damn shame," he muttered, under his breath shaking his head. "Folks around here stay far from that place." I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to know if he'd ever seen whatever it was what I'd seen. But the words stuck in my throat, and after a few minutes of silence, I felt myself slipping into an uneasy sleep, exhausted from the night before. I woke up with a deep yawn. We were parked outside a small gas station on what seemed like the edge of a small town. The driver was talking to a mechanic, pointing toward my broken down car, which he'd somehow managed to tow while I slept. He gestured to me to get out, handing me an old thermos of coffee before saying, "This is as far as I can go, kid. You do well to get in that car and keep going. Some places ain't worth visiting." I nodded, barely able to manage a thank you, and watched as he drove off, leaving me in a town I'd never been to before. The mechanic gave me a sympathetic look as he worked on my car, and for a long time neither of us said anything, but just as he finished up, he glanced at me, a strange, unreadable look in his eyes. "You know that hotel? Place has been closed for decades. Your friend told me about it. You should count yourself lucky. Not many people drive down that highway." I froze, my stomach dropping. "No, that's not possible," I stammered. "I was just there last night. There was a woman at the desk. I got a room." He gave me a wary look, like he'd heard this before. "You'd be surprised how many folks stay there, thinking it's real. I've heard stories like yours a dozen times over. Trust me, kid, whatever you think you saw in there was not real." I felt a chill wash over me. What happened there?" I forced myself to ask. The mechanic glanced around as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. "It used to be a respectable place, that hotel, but something changed. Some say guests went missing. Others say it was the owners, the husband and wife who ran it. One day folks just stopped seeing them around. Only thing anyone knows for sure is that people who stay there, sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't." I wanted to protest, to insist that what I'd seen was real, but he was already closing up, giving me a look that said he didn't want to talk about it any further. I thanked him and got into my car, hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. As I drove out of town, I kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing, just the empty highway stretching behind me, just miles of desolate road. Days went by and I tried to put the whole thing behind me, to convince myself it was just a nightmare. I tried to have a good time with my parents, but that night changed me. My dreams were plagued with whispers, scratching sounds, glimpses of pale, twisted figures hiding in the shadows. I'd wake up in a sweat, heart racing, feeling that same suffocating pressure as if something unseen was watching me. I decided to leave my parents' place a week early. They kind of already knew something was bothering me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them. Maybe they knew about the motel, but if they did, they would probably be like that mechanic. Probably would tell me to stay away or that what I experienced wasn't real. And then one night, as I was getting ready for bed after the long drive back home, I received a letter. It was placed right on my doorstep. I slowly picked it up. It arrived with no return address. The envelope was old and yellowed, as if it had been forgotten for years. I almost didn't open it, but something compelled me to. My hand shook as I slid the paper out, unfolding it to reveal 2 words scrawled in faded ink. Room 13. I dropped the letter as my eyes widened and immediately ran to check every lock in my apartment. I even called the cops to have them do a full, thorough search. Nothing came of it. I swear it felt like I was losing my mind. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt that same chilling presence, that pressure building, like something waiting for me to close my eyes long enough. In the days that followed, things got worse. Objects in my apartment would move on their own. A glass would slide across the table. The lights would flicker, and every so often I'd catch a faint smell of mildew, that same metallic odor from the hotel room. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that it was waiting for me to return to room 13. Finally, I decided I just couldn't take it anymore. I'd go back, just to prove to myself that it wasn't real, that I'd imagined it all. Part of me wishes that I had. I drove out to that same stretch of highway, my heart hammering as I neared the spot where the hotel should have been. But when I got there, I slammed on the brakes. I grew cold, the color drained from my face. No! No! The hotel was gone. There was no building, no flickering neon sign, not even a foundation to mark where it had been. It was just an empty lot overgrown with weeds, as if nothing had ever been there at all. My mind spun, grasping for answers, for anything to explain what I'd been through, but as I sat there in stunned silence, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure, standing at the edge of the lot. It was the old woman from the front desk, her hollow eyes staring straight into mine, her face twisted in that sad, empty smile. I wanted to scream. I tried to turn to look directly at her, but by the time I twisted around, she was gone. I don't drive at night anymore. I moved what seems like countless times now. I can't sleep. I can't eat. People have tried to reach out and check up on me. I ignore them. I don't want whatever this is to affect them too. No matter where I go, no matter how far I try to run, I could still feel them, watching, waiting, and sometimes, in the dead of night, when everything is silent, I can still hear that faint, rasping whisper. Room 13 will always need a guest. Mom, Dad, if you're reading this, I just want you to know I love you. I love you so much. And to whoever else is reading this, help me. Please, help me. Whatever that thing is, I believe it just wants what you have. It wants to exist. But it has one major problem. It either does not have any identity or it's unaware of its own. Therefore, it feels the need to assume yours. A typical parasite. It does not matter which medium it uses. It can strike anywhere, anytime, and anyhow. Therefore, to help you with awareness and prevention, here are some of the methods I have witnessed it use. A prepaid call or SMS coming from your own number, and on your own mobile phone or landline. A video or audio call or message or post coming from your own profile regardless of the social media application used, even this one. A call on the intercom of your own apartment. An email from your own email address. A letter mysteriously delivered at your address with your own name as the expediter. And even mail pigeons landing near your windows with rolled papers around their necks. There is no concrete profile that can be established when it comes to its victims, as it does not discriminate between you or your 9-year-old little brother or daughter with a cell phone or tablet. Once it targets you, it contacts you, and if it gets your response, you disappear within a certain amount of time, never to be seen again. How do you know all that, you might be wondering? Look, I want you to know that I'm not very proud of what I am about to reveal concerning myself. Know that out there, some people with tremendous financial means, influence, and power do not have your best interest at heart, if they have one, that is. Unfortunately, I happen to work for them at some point in my life and witnessed the extent of cruelty they are willing to reach in the name of progress. So please understand that I cannot mention names. Among the many atrocities they managed to lay their hands on is that entity they chose to name Kevin, a name it never responded to. Like I mentioned earlier, it seems to lack any identity of its own, and does not have any appearance whatsoever until it assumes the one of its most recent victim for a period of 34 minutes at most. Since I never worked on the field, I have no idea how those evil people keep track of that thing, after deliberately releasing it out there for their research purposes. But I chose to risk my safety if it can save at least one life, even just one. I made that decision the day I saw their report. There is one report of an analysis, a video call hacked and included, that I will never erase from my mind. On a Saturday afternoon while at work, an innocent mom of 2 received a video call from herself that she unfortunately picked up. The guys from the IT had hacked her phone screen and her front camera, thus allowing us to see the concerned look on the innocent mother's face. The phone screen was entirely black until she said the usual, "Hello," thus providing the entity with what it always seeks, a response. At that moment the sound came on, and movements could be observed from the screen as if the caller was walking. Soon, voices of an adult woman greeting people, a teenage boy asking his mom where her car was, and an enthusiastic young girl followed. After a few seconds, the entity revealed itself as her doppelganger, standing in front of her house, smiling maliciously to the camera, with her own kids playing in the background. Crushed with terror, fear, and disbelief, the mother muttered a simple "Who?" unable to complete her question, before screaming the name of her children in an indescribable distress and in vain. Her car was later found abandoned in the middle of a road, leading to her address with no trace of her. As the last clues she left behind were frantic calls to one of her neighbors, her son, and the police. No strange call was found in any history on her phone, probably erased by the IT guys or the entity itself. Even those evil people are not immune to that strange being, and to be honest with you, neither them nor myself know of any defensive mean against that entity in any case of voluntary response. Prevention is the only way I know to avoid its deadly grasp. I sometimes hear knocks on my front door at various times of random days, and since it has already proved that it is not bound to electronics, I avoid any verbal response and simply open the door. Often, it is really a human being, a delivery person, an acquaintance, a family member, or a friend, but sometimes there is nobody at the door, or maybe nobody that I can see. Well, that'll be it for today, everybody. Here. Found some really good stories today. These 3 were probably some of the best I could find in a short amount of time, since I decided to make this video on a sort of whim. I just got bored, to be honest. But, if you enjoyed the content you saw today, it would be awesome if you left a like, or hey, maybe even subscribe. Comment down below which was your favorite story. Personally, I know which one's my favorite, but I'd like to see you guys guess. And if you want to see more content like this, here would probably be a great place to start. And with that out of the way, have a wonderful day.